he had won independence for his country, emerged as one of Africa's most celebrated statesmen, and had single-handedly ruled Zambia for 27 seemingly endless years. At one time, it had seemed that Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda would rule forever. Kaunda's socialism, which included wholesale nationalization of industries and the imposition of agricultural collectives, ruined the economy. But last week, Kaunda was finally humbled. Shortly after his landslide victory, Chiluba was sworn in as Zambia's second president, and the first democratically elected one in more than 2 decades.
You win some and you lose some elections.
So let's begin. So firstly, before I dive into how Zambia failed to be a communist or socialist state, let's go back to 1945. In that year, World War II came to an end.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
The Allied forces that included the UK, the US and many other Western nations had defeated Nazi Germany, as well as the Japanese. Then in 1964, Zambia gains independence from its colonial masters, the British, and a new government is installed that is run by our first late great president, Kenneth Kaunda. Just right after independence, him and his government noticed that there was an economic boom that was happening in the country. But a small group of people were benefiting from this economic boom. And these were mainly foreign nationals that owned large corporations like the mining industries, the manufacturing industries, wholesale businesses, transport businesses and all this. So the government came up in 1968, the government came up with the Mulungushi economic reforms. These reforms were sort of more like socialist reforms. So the main goal was to make sure that each and every person in the country was equal in the amount of money they had, in the amount of property they owned and everything. It was more like to make everything equal for everyone. So part of these reforms seemed quite biased to some of these foreign nationals. Like I came across this document from the CIA, it's quite old, it was declassified. So let me just explain something that I realized from this document. If we go back to the period after World War II, there was a period called the Cold War. So during this period it was more like the Soviets, so the communists, versus the liberals and like the Americans and the UK, whatever, those liberal people were trying democracy. So it was more like communism versus democracy and socialism versus capitalism. So it was more like a battle for influence between the Soviet Union as well as the US. And Zambia, just after Zambia gained independence, Zambia seemed to move towards or be more influenced by the Soviets. So in this document, the Americans were just talking about their views on Zambia at the time. Also just looking at how Zambia was introducing the Mulungushi reforms that seemed quite communist or had communist influence to them. So in these Mulungushi reforms, there was some parts that included nationalization of industries. So like the mines, the railways, the public transport, and some manufacturing industries, and many other corporations were going to be now owned by the government. So the government gave most of these foreign-owned businesses or monopolistic companies options. Well, to tell the owners of the company either to gain Zambian citizenship and continue to operate, or to sell their businesses. Some other corporations were told either to give the government the majority share of the company, that's like 51% and above, or get out of the country. And also for loaning industries like the banks and other loaning companies, they were told to favor the local people, the Zambian people, as opposed to the foreign nationals. There are just a few things that were included in the Mulungushi reforms. And these reforms came into place. So later on, a couple years later, in most of the industries, the government was running them. And at the time, it brought some sort of a balance to how things were being run in the country. there was a bit of a balance when the government was involved in all of this. But there was pressure that was coming from the West, the Western countries. Like in terms of whether when Zambia wanted funding, foreign funding, maybe from the Western countries, most of the times they were not really given that funding. They were being pressured to say, okay, we can give you the funding, but you have to privatize most of the companies in the nation. So they wanted privatization. So it was a pressure that kept on going on. The government had also realized that even though they had introduced these Mulungushi reforms, there was still a small group of people that was still getting most of the wealth in the country. And these were mainly, or the top people in most of the industries like the mining industry, railways, public transport, the top people, the leaders, they say the CEOs who are running these companies, or the people who are mainly benefiting from those companies. And still it showed that these reforms weren't so effective during the time. But later on, there was too much pressure from the people in the country as well as from foreign countries for the nation to privatize most of its industries. And that's what happened in the early 1990s. And privatization came into being. Then later on, elections were held too, because during the period from 1964 till the early 1990s, Zambia was a one-party state. And then after foreign pressure as well as pressure from people in the nation, Zambia became a democracy and elections were held in which a new political party took over the government, the MMD. And since then, Zambia has become a bit of a capitalist kind of state. But democracy is ruling in the nation. Anyway, people, thank you for checking out this video. Remember to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll catch you on my next video. Peace.